This is Sleeping in Trees, the audiobook, Chapter 47, The Fourth. My first real summer in Seattle was approaching, and, with my pyrotechnic interests in full bloom, the 4th of July was an extra special day. To my grave disappointment, I realized shortly after moving that Seattle seemed to be a bit more advanced than Miami when it came to culture and general socio-political development. Things seemed more defined and buttoned down. They had more laws. I did not know if it was their concern over forest fires due to the state's broad expanses of evergreens, or if they just didn't like noise. Perhaps they thought fireworks could be dangerous. Regardless, the city and town councils seemed to have spent quite a bit of time focused on the sale and lighting of fireworks, and had passed laws to keep it all locked down and well under control. Unlike in South Miami, a kid couldn't just acquire fireworks and set them off in the front yard. Seattle laws made those activities illegal, and the citizenry seemed to be aligned in support of their laws. There was little tolerance for illegal fireworks activities. Imagine the enthusiastic response, then, of my new neighborhood crew when they learned of my bomb-building capabilities. Barely able to get their hands on a couple of ladyfinger firecrackers, half an inch long and as thin as a cocktail stirrer, holding a 30-foot coil of waterproof fuse and a couple of pounds of flash powder in their hands, was beyond belief. Further, they had never contemplated constructing a bomb by encasing a flash powder-filled aluminum film canister in epoxy for that extra loud concussion of sound. They were neophytes, and I was soon regarded as an experienced professional. The aura of the out-of-town expert had the desired and predictable effect. As the 4th of July approached, I cranked up my modest explosives factory to full capacity. It had 2 locations, my bedroom and the garage. I implemented the age-old bigger is better theme in one of the few areas of my life where I could actually control the outcome. As I elevated my game and the size and power of my explosive devices grew, I also realized that the relationship between both was directly governed by my parents' level of disapproval. I made sure my bomb manufacturing was a clandestine affair. Moving past masking tape and toilet paper roll tubes, which made a deep, rich sound, it was on to epoxy casings, which had a more destructive power. Then I began to experiment with steel pipe. To me, steel pipe was the ultimate endgame, as I could not imagine another material and design superior to a short piece of 1-inch steel tubing with threaded end caps. I also could not imagine a device more deadly. The reason a firecracker makes a bang is all about physics. When ignited, the rapidly burning chemical is really just high-speed corrosion, rust, which creates gases that want to escape their tight space in a hurry. In their effort to do so, sound waves are created. The harder and the faster the gases try to escape, the louder the sound and greater the explosive force. Imagine how hard it is for these supersonic gaseous forces to get out of a steel enclosure with no exit, and what then becomes of the enclosure when the gases ultimately prevail. The gases will prevail, guaranteed by Mr. Physics. It's formulaic, like math, where the response to certain inputs are assured. It works the same way every time, an unalterable force. When the steel in a pipe bomb gives it up to the gases, it splits and cracks and splinters. This is shrapnel. Considering the force and power that can fracture a steel pipe, shrapnel is very nasty stuff. The day I completed my first pipe bomb and held it in my hand, it scared me. I realized for the first time that I had entered a new critical zone where my hobby, once exciting and creative, was now very deadly. One small mistake in either building or transporting a pipe bomb, and people could die. This gnawed at me from that day on as I rolled over and over in my mind whether or not I had entered a place from which it was finally time to retreat. I also wondered at which point a firework was not a firework, but a bomb. It was perhaps this juxtaposition, mixed with a healthy dose of fear, that led me to go light on the bombs that 4th of July and stick with paper tubes and lots of masking tape. Jumbo firecrackers, if you will. The size alone I had planned would ensure huge concussions of sound. There would be plenty of loud booms, just the same. The big day arrived, and my inventory was ready. 8 handmade masterpieces were all set for a lighted match or a cigarette timing fuse. That afternoon, I placed them very carefully in a brown paper lunch bag and walked down the road en route to a friend's house where we would further strategize so as to maximize the explosive impact of my handmade pyrotechnics. I had just turned the corner at the end of the street when I was jarred by the sight of a black and white police cruiser slowly coming up the road. I mumbled to myself, "Ain't no way." As I walked along nonchalantly, I could hear the cruiser creeping up behind me, its fan belt squeaking and gravel crunching beneath its tires. The officer pulled abreast and lowered a whining passenger side window. I could not believe my lack of good luck. He greeted me in a friendly enough manner, so I had fleeting hope. The officer asked where I was headed. I told him I was on my way to a friend's house about a mile away. Then he popped the question I dreaded the moment I spotted him approaching. He asked me what was in the bag. Two years earlier, well before the experimental move to Seattle, Dork was spending the night, and we decided to sneak out. We had a great plan to walk to the local 7-Eleven, about 2 miles away. Rather than creep through people's side yards the whole way, we just decided to walk right along the side of the main road, 124th Street. About halfway there, a car drove past us, braked, and pulled over. It was a cop. He opened his door and stepped out to address us. He asked our names first, and then how old we were, and finally, where were we headed. We happily responded, realizing that, for that night at least, we had not been involved in a single act of malfeasance. Then we made a fatal mistake. He asked if our parents knew where we were. It was 2 a.m., and we should have thought through the likelihood that any parents would permit 2 13-year-old boys to walk 2 miles to a ratty 7-Eleven in the middle of the night. Sure, our parents knew where we were. We lied. He asked again if we were sure about that. I affirmed our answer, and Dork nodded his head. In that case, the officer suggested, it would not be a problem if his dispatcher called our parents to let them know all was well with their boys, in case they had wondered. Oh, crap. Sitting in the back of the patrol car, the mesh steel barrier separating us from the hulking officer began to look more and more like the bars of the maximum security prison I'd seen recently on a Saturday afternoon TV drama. I looked at Dork. He was frozen stiff with eyes bugged wide open. I could tell he was processing the outcome of this fiasco and the pain of the punishment that would certainly follow. Within a few moments, the pressure became too great. We cracked. We came clean. Our parents were home asleep, and they had absolutely no idea where we were, we blabbered. The officer asked where I lived, and I gave him the address. He turned and slowly drove us away. En route, he asked if we understood why he was taking us home and would be waking up my parents with their son and friend in police custody. I said no, and quickly pointed out that we were not aware of any curfew laws. This did not go over too well, as I noticed now that he raised his voice a bit and his thick neck stiffened as he continued to speak. The reason we were not on our way to 7-Eleven, and instead in the back of a patrol car to be delivered personally to groggy and angry parents, was simple. We had lied. Worse yet, we had lied to an officer of the law. His short speech and the torturous drive are still fresh today, some 45 years later. When the dust settled, and there was some dust, Dork and I discussed the evening gone wrong and the lessons we'd learned. The next time we wouldn't be so foolish. We'd stick to the side yards and stay well clear of the main roads. With the Seattle officer watching me intently as he awaited my response, that Miami night played out in my mind's eye, and I decided to tell the truth. Mostly. I told the officer that in the brown paper lunch bag were a few firecrackers. He asked if I minded if he took a look for himself. I complied. Within 60 seconds, I was in the back seat of the cruiser on a courtesy ride straight home. Dad was outside the garage fiddling around with some project. When he spotted me slumping sheepishly down in the back seat behind the steel mesh cage, he stiffened. He approached the car timidly as the officer opened his door and stepped out. When he reached to open my door, Dad visibly relaxed. At least at that point, he knew there would be no arrest. The story was told. My dad played the naive New Washington State residents unfamiliar with all the different laws angle, and it worked pretty well. There was a cordial conclusion, and the officer drove away, my bag of bombs resting on his front seat. Apologetic and deferential is my recommendation whenever dealing with a police officer. Since Mom was my pyro sponsor, Dad really didn't have much to say other than to suggest I probably should have been more discreet in the transportation of my explosives. He genuinely felt bad that I had worked so hard for weeks to build such an impressive cache, only to have them confiscated by the local police. We stood around later that evening after dinner as the sun silently disappeared in the murk behind the forested hills of Mercer Island, and watched the sky light up all around us with impressive fireworks set off by the towns nearby. They were well organized, fully sanctioned, and legal. Dad and I stood quietly next to one another and leaned on the railing of the long deck that overlooked the waterway behind our house. We watched fiery streaks zoom skyward, followed by the blooms of flowery explosions that quickly flickered and faded, and listened to the deep booms, delayed a bit by the distance they had to travel from a few miles away. I felt a bit dejected and somehow left out of the celebrations, but even though my 4th of July was a dud, I still had hope that my creations were somehow, on that proud American night, igniting cheers, smiles, and applause somewhere among the hills of Seattle. Dad and I spoke little, but did speculate about what an off-duty police officer with a couple of kids might be doing right about then. Lobster always was a spaz, and this idiotic act proved it true. It's up next, Chapter 48, and it's called Hurdler.